Hey everyone, welcome to today's edition of One Single Story, where each weekday we offer a brief lesson from a section of today's reading, then we examine a single relevant question that passage points us to. Today I'm joined by Alyssa Bream, and we're looking at a passage from Genesis chapter 30. There is this rivalry between Rachel and Leah, their siblings. So the text is a little bit odd, or can strike you as odd. We can hardly imagine in our mind pushing a father pushing his oldest daughter into the bedroom to consummate a marriage with her sister's fiance. She's fooling if she's a part of this. There's a lot of questions, like did Leah have an option? We don't have the details as to what role Leah played in this deception, except that she went through with it. We don't know if she was complicit or if she was pressed by her father Laban into deceiving Jacob. At any rate, Leah enters the tent that night and consummates a marriage with her sister's fiance without ever letting on that she is not Rachel. The second question is, did Rachel have an option? The text also silent about how Laban kept Rachel out of the picture during the wedding ceremony and what should have been her honeymoon night. We are left to imagine what kind of emotions she must have been facing. One fact that is often misunderstood about this story surrounds exactly when Rachel was given to Jacob as a second wife. Jacob had clearly worked for 7 years for the hand of Rachel. After he is deceived into marrying Leah, at first glance it seems he is required to work another 7 years as the fiancé of Rachel while simultaneously being married to Leah. But chapter 29, verse 27 makes it clear that Rachel was also given to Jacob as a second wife after the 1-week bridal celebration for Leah was concluded. So Jacob spent the 7 years of dowry for Rachel while he was married to both Rachel and Leah. We assume that neither Rachel nor Leah would have chosen this love triangle as a family model, that neither one would have wanted it. But it seems their own father has placed them in a dysfunctional and competitive marriage relationship. The motive for Laban's action seems to come from his misplaced value of wealth. We learn from chapter 31 that Laban desires to keep Jacob attached to his family specifically because Jacob's shepherding knowledge brought him incredible material increase. Now, the ancient Near East culture emphasizes that part of the woman's value lies in her ability to produce children. In large part, this is due to the societal structure of that culture. So a man's workforce in an agricultural society comes from his own household. The more sons he is able to produce, the more workers he has for his farm, and the more wealth he has the potential to achieve. While this value system for women strikes the Western reader as stereotypical and maybe even demeaning, Rachel and Leah clearly measure their personal value as a wife by the standard of their ability to produce children. So you can see as an example, and Leah named him Asher, for she said, "What joy is mine, now the other women will celebrate with me," in Genesis 30:13. There are also some indications in this text that Rachel and Leah were both personally affected by the actions of their father, particularly in his misplaced value of personal wealth. These issues might have contributed to the desire to be valued and loved by Jacob. So Leah has children, but she doesn't have love. She clearly views her ability to easily have children as a reflection of her personal value as a wife. She struggles with the fact that in spite of her childbearing, she does not have the heart of her husband. She is portrayed in the storyline as a daughter who has been sold out by her father for sheep and goats, and as a wife who is still trying to produce material value, sons, in order to find fulfillment in love. When it seemed her childbearing had come to a pause, she gave her maidservant to Jacob so that he could make her pregnant and so she could claim more children in her name. When her maidservant birthed another son, she ironically describes that son in terms that her father would likely use. God has rewarded me for giving my servant to my husband as a wife. The translation from the Hebrew is, God has given me my wages because I gave my maid to my husband. Rachel, on the other hand, has love but no children. She's crushed by her inability to have children. Genesis 30:1 clearly states that she was jealous of her sister because Leah was able to bear children. This is the first mention of individual jealousy in the scriptures. In fact, this is the first time in the story that we read what Rachel felt. This verse also records her words for the first time: "Give me children, or I'll die." She has moved from jealousy to bitterness and blame, somehow making her childless womb Jacob's fault. And the emotional depth here of their competition is revealed in verses 14 through 18, where Leah hires Jacob with her sons' mandrakes. Mandrakes were a small tomato-like fruit. They have a narcotic smell and a sweet taste, but are too poisonous to be used as food. Instead, they are burned or boiled and then inhaled like a narcotic. So they were doing drugs in the Bible.
What do narcotics smell like?
I'm getting ready to be in trouble for saying that too. Somebody's going to take offense to that. They were well known also as an aphrodisiac in ancient times and believed to be able to encourage contraception. Sometimes these
Opposite, not contraception.
Oh, conception. Oh, thank you. Thank you.
I just don't want to confuse people.
I misread my notes. Sometimes these are referred to as love apples, which is a really strange way to name them. The implication is that Rachel is turning to herbal medicines in order to aid her conception. In contrast to other women in Scripture who struggled with conception, Sarah, Rebecca, Hannah, Elizabeth, we do not hear Rachel praying to God for children. However, both Rachel and Leah recognize God's hand is somehow involved in the ability to conceive a child. So what is this solution? How do you solve a sibling rivalry and dysfunction? So both Rachel and Leah seem to have flashes of insight throughout their childbearing seasons. While none of these insights seem to have caused a radical or permanent character change, nevertheless, they do represent an inner surrendering to God that can heal dysfunction. In Genesis 29:31 through 35, it records the birth of Leah's first 4 sons. In each case, she was longing for the love of her husband, hoping that her ability to produce children would merit his love. But at the birth of her 4th son, she makes a shift in her perspective. She named him Judah, for she said, "Now I will praise the Lord." And then you have a son by the same name. Even without receiving her heart's desire, she chooses to praise God. Interestingly, Jesus was born from the tribe of Judah. Rachel demonstrates a flash of insight, although it was after she finally had her first son. The author of Genesis indicates that God remembered Rachel's plight and answered her prayer. To her credit, Rachel did not attribute the birth of her firstborn to herbal medicine or to her husband. She said, "God has removed my disgrace." In that moment, she declared that the only one who can truly remove shame and disgrace is God. So, Alyssa, let's talk about a couple of things. One, why is it so common that we turn to bitterness and blame when we're facing situations that we can't control?
That's actually like a very well-studied psychological thing that it's called the locus of control, that when there's an external locus of control, when we believe that all of our fate, for lack of a better word, is decided by things outside of our control, that causes mental issues like depression and anxiety and just a general unwellness. And then when we feel like we have control, that things we do actually affect our life, we're able to be happier. And so we kind of, as Christians, I think we live in this paradox of realizing that God is in ultimate control, but that we have to realize that we're partners with God and that what we do truly does affect our lives. And so when we start to feel like everything is out of our control, it just spirals and we feel helpless. I don't know if you've ever felt helpless in a situation, but when there's nothing you can do to change an outcome and you know that something bad is going to happen oh man, those are some of the worst moments. I think that you start to feel that probably with kids, as kids make decisions and there's only so much you can do. As my children are starting to get older, I have to let them make mistakes. I have to feel helpless at times, and it's difficult because you want things to be under your control because you feel like then you'll be able to make things go right.
And you think you know what's best.
Right.
And often we don't know
Mm-hmm.
what's best. I can't think of a time that I got bitter. Okay. That's typically, I think some of that is personality driven in how we
Mm-hmm.
deal with things, either, but I can think of times when I place blame. I think that's a much more natural process, blaming other people or blaming God. Um, the comparison piece, though, I think may lead to more bitterness than we realize,
Mm-hmm.
Um, and as I've gotten older, um, I've realized how dangerous comparison can be, because that's what's going on here. There's this competition. I feel like I've got to
Mm-hmm.
be what they are. If I'm not, I'm failing.
Right.
Or I did all of the things right, and my kids. You talked about parenting. They still made these choices. Um, that's the weird thing about it is sometimes you can do everything right, and it still turns out completely wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And that's extremely frustrating, because and we believe we know what is best. What kind of things, what kind of patterns do you think lead people to being bitter?
We just finished up a series on anger as we're recording this, and I think almost any of those negative emotions that you feel, if you don't deal with them, it'll lead to bitterness. It will lead to this underlying unease in your life, and it will come out in these ways that are not helpful for you or for other people around you. Will lead to broken relationships, and it's when we don't deal with the bad things in our life that will lead to the bitterness. When we don't maybe take the steps we need to, or as we talked about the last time we were on I was on the podcast, reframing things of trying to make the best of the situation, that it will just lead to that bitterness and that resentment and the unease of life that is so easy to get to.
You talked about anger, and we talked about how that is one of the fruit of anger. Bitterness is, and I think any of the other things that not dealt with, will, as you said, lead to bitterness, because that, we can't always be in a rage, but
Right.
we've got to justify why we feel what we feel.
Mm-hmm.
So then it becomes bitterness. But pushing that out and figuring out how to expel that, and I don't want to re-preach that sermon, but Barbara and I are listening to a book while we ride right now. It's called Fight Right by John Gottman and his wife. And one of the things he talks about is recognizing when you're being flooded, and not recognizing when the other person's being flooded, and say, hey, I think you're flooded.
Mm-hmm.
We need to take a break, because that just makes it worse.
Right.
Recognizing your own, when you're being flooded with emotion, and I don't have time to explain all of that, but it's just when you just start being overwhelmed with all of those
Mm-hmm.
emotions that come, and being able to step away and figure out how to expel those things, just move them out so that you can come back and deal with whatever the issue is. Because when we're not self-aware enough to know that these things are
Mm-hmm.
pouring over us, and I don't know, over my life, I know for the last few years, I've tried to watch, measure, like I can almost know when I can feel it bubbling, like I
Mm-hmm.
know that, somebody's going to be in trouble if I don't deal with this, right? And that's usually what happens, right? Is when we don't deal with it, it bubbles out on somebody else, and then they suffer because we haven't dealt with our bitterness or anger or dysfunction in whatever way. Is praise? So you have a son named Judah. I'm assuming that was intentional. Here it seems to be intentional. Where her shift turns away from her husband, right, and turns toward God. Can praise in moments of dysfunction help us heal dysfunction, and if so, how?
Turning to God in these situations is sometimes your only resort. There was a sermon that is seared in my mind from when I was in high school. I was on a mission trip to Chicago, and we'd go out during the day and do ministry, and then in the evenings we'd come and have service at Wheaton. And there was a guy and I remember him screaming this question, do you want to be well? And from John 5, 1-15, Jesus asked the person, do you want to be well? And it's like, that's a stupid question. Who wouldn't want to be well? But sometimes in life, I think we want to languish in that bitterness. We want to feel that pain because it feels good to maybe be angry and to try to get revenge or do things like that. But I think that's the question, that if you're dealing with that bitterness and you're dealing with the anger, you're dealing with whatever dysfunction, do you want to get well? Are you willing to take the steps that it takes to get well? And I think that part of that is turning to God. And sometimes when it's a bad day and you turn on the right worship song, that can help turn it around. It can help refocus your pain. And singing in and of itself helps regulate your nervous system. It helps the nerves realign and do all those things that there's great science out there that I am not going to even try to say, but like it actually physically helps you. So all these songs in the Bible, all these Psalms, they were probably sung, and that was part of it, is that it physically helped you to feel better. So I think praising God is a great first step if you want to be well.
I would agree. That's a good entry point. And I think you're right that whole, do you want to be well? I don't know that I think some things are that simple, right? You've got to decide, I want to move in this direction. And we have all seen the heartbreak of people. The place I hear that the most is from parents or loved ones who've tried to help an addict, and they've spent years of their life. And then they finally had to say, it's got to be their decision. And until they decide. And then, some cases you hear these great stories where they decided and they made that move. And then other times they just never do. They never make that decision to get well. And the same is true of dysfunction in our family. Do you want a better marriage? Do you want to be a better parent? Those are decisions, they're choices you have to make. Or would you rather just live in, and there is some martyrdom that happens in those situations, some hero or, sympathy that might be gained because, we put up with these things. But the reality is we have to decide. Yeah, that's a really good question. So. Well, thank you for joining us today on this edition of One Single Story. We hope you'll be back with us tomorrow as we continue a conversation on dysfunction from the book of Genesis.